The year was 1803, and England had finally exhaled. With the threat of Napoleon's armies momentarily quieted across the Channel, the nation's heroes had returned home, swapping muddy battlefields for polished ballroom floors. A new kind of fever had gripped the drawing rooms of London, a scarlet fever. To the ambitious mothers of the ton, a man in a regimental uniform was the season's most coveted prize, a symbol of valor and, more importantly, a promising match. Every dinner party, every musical, and every winter ball became a strategic campaign, with daughters pushed forward like beautifully decorated soldiers on a marital battlefield. And tonight, at the Duke of Blackwood's annual winter gala, the air was particularly charged with this unspoken warfare. The air in the ballroom was thick enough to swallow. It tasted of beeswax from the hundreds of candles dripping in the chandeliers, mingled with the cloying sweetness of ladies' perfumes and the sharp, clean scent of gentlemen's cologne. For Timothy Ashbourne, it was suffocating. 3 months home from the continent, and the gloss of London society had already worn to a dull, irritating sheen. The polite laughter felt hollow, the string quartet a distant, whining drone. It was all a performance, and he had forgotten his lines. He stood with Captain Evans and Lieutenant Croft near a marble column, the scarlet of his dress uniform a stark slash of colour against the room's sea of silks and satins. The silver epaulets on his shoulders felt heavier than they ever had on a battlefield. "Still no prospects, Ashbourne?" Captain Evans murmured, swirling the amber brandy in his glass. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the crowd of eligible young women. "I thought for certain you'd have been ensnared by now. Lady Anne was practically throwing herself at your feet a moment ago." Timothy followed his gaze to the woman in question, a vision in pale blue, surrounded by a tittering flock of admirers. "Lady Anne and I would bore one another to tears within a fortnight," he said, his voice flat. He took a sip of his own drink, the burn of it a welcome distraction. Lieutenant Croft let out a low chuckle. His standards are too high. He seeks a goddess, not a woman. A familiar irritation pricked at Timothy's skin. It was the same jest they'd been needling him with since their return. In the barracks, it had been a welcome reprieve from the grim reality of their duties. Here, under the glittering chandeliers, it just felt cheap. "I seek someone with a spark of life in her eyes," Timothy countered, his voice lower than he intended. "Someone who doesn't look at me and see only my father's title." Evans smirked, a cruel, knowing thing. "A challenge, then. You think you can charm any woman you choose, is that it? The great war hero, the Duke's son." The words were a direct strike to his pride. He felt the heat rise in his neck. He had never considered himself a charmer. He was a soldier. He was direct, honest, and often too quiet for the liking of society. But to have his friends, men he'd fought alongside, imply he was incapable. It was an insult he couldn't let stand. "I'm sure I could manage," he said, the words clipped. Croft's eyes lit up, sensing an opportunity. "Then let's make it interesting. A wager." 50 guineas. Timothy stared at him. "A wager on what?" "We choose the lady," Evans supplied, leaning in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You have 6 months to make her fall completely and utterly in love with you. Not just an infatuation. We're talking declarations, stolen glances, the whole insipid affair." The cold, calculated cruelty of it settled like a stone in Timothy's gut. To play with a woman's affections like that, it was dishonorable. It was everything he wasn't. But he saw the challenging glint in their eyes, the smirks that said they thought he'd refuse. They thought him too proper, too rigid, too weak for their game. His jaw tightened. Pride, that old familiar traitor, made the decision for him. Fine, he heard himself say. The word felt foreign on his tongue. You have a deal. A triumphant grin split Evans's face. He and Croft exchanged a look of pure mischief. Their eyes began a slow, deliberate sweep of the room. Then Evans's gaze stopped. He lifted his chin slightly, a silent indication. There. Her. Timothy followed his line of sight, past the dancers to the refreshment table. Standing there was a young woman with a mane of honey-blonde hair pinned up in a simple style. She wore a gown of deep emerald green that lacked the ostentatious frills of the other women. As he watched, she glanced around quickly before deftly plucking a small pastry from a silver tray and slipping it into her reticule. Croft snorted into his glass. Miss Ruth Mansfield. Perfect. The name hit Timothy like a physical blow. His blood ran cold. Ruth. He remembered a girl of 15 with dirt on her cheek, laughing as she outclimbed him on the tallest oak of his father's estate. A girl whose family lands had bordered his own, whose father had been his father's closest friend, before the Baron's debts consumed everything. You remember her, don't you, Ashbourne? Evans pressed, his voice laced with malice. Little Ruth, daughter of the late Baron Mansfield, used to trail after you like a shadow before her family's misfortune. Title's still there, but the fortune is long gone. She'll be grateful for the attention from a man of your station. Grateful. The word was a desecration. This was no longer a dishonorable game with a stranger. It was a monstrous act aimed at a girl he had once known, whose fall from grace had been whispered about with pity and scorn. To use their shared past, a past she probably wanted to forget, as a weapon against her. It was beyond cruel. He remembered her fierce pride, even as a child. He looked at her now, standing tall despite it all, and saw not an easy target, but a survivor. Then she threw her head back and laughed at something the old woman beside her said. It wasn't a polite titter. It was a genuine warm sound that carried across the room, a brief, beautiful note in a symphony of artifice. The same laugh he remembered from the branches of the old oak tree. And in that moment, Timothy Ashbourne hated himself. He hated his friends. He hated the bet. This wasn't just about honor anymore. This was personal. This was a betrayal of a memory. Well? Croft prompted, his eyes gleaming. Do you concede? Perhaps the target is a little too close to home. Concede. The word was a slap. To back down now would be to admit they had found his weakness. That she was his weakness. His pride, stubborn and unyielding, would not allow it. He gave a single, sharp nod, his gaze still fixed on her. No, Timothy said, his voice a low rasp. I do not concede. Evans clapped him hard on the shoulder. That's the spirit. 6 months, Ashbourne. The clock starts now. His friends moved off, already laughing. But Timothy remained rooted to the spot, the weight of his word pressing down on him. He watched Ruth Mansfield, the girl from his past, now the unwitting object of a callous game. The conquest, his target. He straightened his uniform and took a deep, steadying breath. The first step was always the hardest. He pushed himself away from the column and began the long walk across the marble floor, each footfall an echo of his own betrayal. The game was on, and a part of him already knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was about to lose far more than 50 guineas. The marble floor felt like a vast, frozen lake he was forced to cross, and with every step, the ice thinned beneath him. The faces of the guests blurred into a tapestry of jewels and vacant smiles. His focus narrowed to one point, the emerald green dress, the honey blonde hair. The woman who was a ghost from a life he'd left behind, a ghost he was now honor-bound to corrupt. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Ruth Mansfield was alone now. Lady Danbury had moved on, swallowed by the crowd, leaving her standing by the wilting floral arrangements. She was adjusting one of her gloves, her movements precise and deliberate, her expression unreadable. She looked calm, poised, and utterly out of place, a wildflower someone had mistakenly put in a vase of hothouse roses. He remembered that look of quiet contemplation from years ago, when she'd be trying to solve a puzzle or decide the best way to scale a garden wall. He stopped a respectable distance from her, the soldier in him calculating the approach. But this was not a battlefield, he understood. There were no rules of engagement for this kind of desecration. He cleared his throat. Miss Mansfield. She turned, and her eyes, the color of a clear winter sky, met his. There was no surprise in them, no girlish flutter of lashes, just a cool, direct assessment that held the weight of 7 years of silence. He felt pinned by her gaze, as if she could see the sordid wager written across his uniform. "Lord Ashbourne," she replied, her voice low and even. The formal title was a deliberate wall erected between the boy she knew and the man standing before her. She offered a small, correct curtsy. "I am surprised to find you so far from the center of the festivities." It was not what he had expected. He had braced himself for awkwardness, perhaps a flicker of an old memory, not this chilling poise, not this quiet, challenging neutrality that threw him completely off balance. "I find the air is better on the fringes," he managed to say, the words feeling clumsy and rehearsed. He felt like a boy of 15 again, not a 25-year-old officer who had commanded men in battle. A faint smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Is it the air, my lord? Or the company?" The question hung between them, sharp as a shard of glass. She was just as intelligent as he remembered. He had known it from the moment he'd seen her, but having that intelligence aimed directly at him was an entirely different experience. She was already probing his defenses. Perhaps a bit of both, he admitted, deciding a sliver of honesty was his only viable strategy. London society is an adjustment after being away. "I can imagine," she said, her gaze sweeping over the glittering ballroom. "It must seem terribly frivolous. All this, after all that." Her words struck a chord of truth, so deep it resonated through his bones. She understood. In one simple sentence, she had articulated the very feeling that had been suffocating him for months. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the bet, past the game, past the fallen baron's daughter. He saw Ruth, the girl who had understood him then, and the woman who, impossibly, seemed to understand him now. He felt a dangerous pull, a longing to abandon the script and just talk to her. He had to get back to the lie. "I saw you speaking with Lady Danbury," he said, grasping for a neutral topic. "She was telling me about her prize-winning roses," Ruth said, a flicker of genuine warmth finally entering her expression, "and how her new gardener is a complete charlatan. She has a talent for finding life in the most mundane of subjects. And you," he thought, "have a talent for laughing like it's the only thing that matters in the world." He wanted to say it. The observation was pure, untainted by the bet, but the words caught in his throat. To offer such a personal, genuine compliment now would be to sharpen the blade of his betrayal. "She is a formidable woman," he said instead. Ruth's smile widened slightly. "She is, and she does not suffer fools. You should remember that, Lord Ashbourne." It felt like a warning, a piece of friendly advice that was anything but. She was telling him, in her own subtle way, that she was not a fool either. The orchestra began a new melody, a waltz that was slower, more intimate. It was now or never. Pride and the imagined smirks of his friends pushed him forward. "Miss Mansfield," he said, extending a gloved hand. He hesitated, then took the risk. "Ruth, would you honor me with this dance?" The use of her first name hung in the air between them, a ghost of their shared past. She looked from his outstretched hand to his face. He watched her mind work, saw the flicker of indecision. She was weighing the invitation, this sudden attention from the Duke's son who hadn't spoken a word to her in 7 years. He could feel her suspicion like a physical barrier. He held his breath, waiting for her refusal. A shameful part of him desperately prayed for it. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was cool through the thin fabric of their gloves. "I would be honored, my lord." She had ignored his use of her name. The wall was back in place. He led her onto the floor, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He remembered dancing with her once, at a midsummer party on her family's lawn, both of them clumsy and laughing. There was no laughter now. As they moved into the rhythm of the waltz, the world shrank to the circle they occupied. The scent of her hair was clean, like lavender and winter air. He was acutely aware of the warmth of her, the subtle strength in the way she held herself. They danced in silence for a few moments, two strangers who knew each other too well, bound together by a lie. He was supposed to be charming her, whispering meaningless pleasantries, but his mind was blank. All he could think about was the steady rhythm of her breathing and the unnerving intelligence in her eyes every time they met his. "You are a very good dancer, my lord," she said, her voice a calm murmur. "Though I confess, you look as though you are marching into battle." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his hand on her waist. She had noticed his rigidity, his tension. She could read him as easily now as she had then. "My apologies," he said, forcing his shoulders to relax. "As I said, I am out of practice with all this." "Then perhaps you should stop thinking about it," she suggested. "Dancing is not a military exercise. There is no objective to be won." "Oh, but there is," he thought, and the thought made his stomach clench with guilt. "You are the objective." He looked down at her, at the calm, serious expression on her face. Evans and Croft were fools. They hadn't seen the fire in her, the sharp mind, the unyielding pride that radiated from her like a shield she was now holding up against him. The music swelled, and he pulled her a fraction closer, guiding her through an intricate turn. For a moment, she leaned into him, and he felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the wager and everything to do with the woman herself. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. When the final notes of the waltz faded, they stood for a moment in the center of the floor, the applause a distant thunder. He released her slowly, reluctantly. "Thank you, Ruth," he whispered, the name slipping out again, a plea. This time her eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, the shield wavered. He saw a flicker of the girl she used to be, a flash of vulnerability that made his chest ache. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a mask of perfect composure. "The honor was mine, Lord Ashbourne," she replied, her voice firm, final. She gave him another small curtsy, a model of decorum. Then she turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd without a backward glance. He stood frozen, watching her go, the space in his arms feeling cold and empty. Across the room, he caught Captain Evans's eye. Evans lifted his brandy glass in a silent, mocking toast and grinned. The first move had been made. He had succeeded. But as he watched Ruth disappear, Timothy felt no triumph. He only felt the crushing weight of the past and the sickening dread of the future he had just set in motion. The game was on, but he was no longer sure who was being played. Timothy did not wait. The memory of the dance, of Ruth's guarded eyes, and the ghost of their shared past had ignited a fire in his gut. The bet was a constant, sickening hum in the back of his mind, but a more urgent, more dangerous feeling had taken root, an obsession. He had to see her, had to break through the polite, defensive walls she had erected. He needed to know if the girl he remembered was still in there. He spent the morning at a bookseller's and emerged with a slim volume of Mary Wollstonecraft's essays. It was a reckless choice, a radical one. It was a statement. Returning to his family's Mayfair townhouse, he gave the order for his carriage to be brought around. The action felt both deliberate and insane. He was mobilizing the full weight of his station, the polished coach, the liveried footman, the family crest on the door, all for a campaign of deceit aimed at a single woman in a modest home. When the carriage stopped on her quiet street, it was a profound intrusion. The grand vehicle looked utterly out of place, drawing curtain-twitching notice from the neighboring houses. This was not a casual visit. It was a declaration, and he felt the weight of it as he stepped onto the pavement, the book in his hand. Ruth herself answered the door. A smudge of ink was on her cheek, and her honey-blonde hair was slightly undone. She saw him, and then her gaze went past him to the enormous, crested carriage waiting at the curb. Her eyes widened, a flicker of alarm and deep suspicion passing through them before she composed herself. "Lord Ashbourne, forgive the intrusion," he said. "I brought something for you." He followed her into the small, worn parlour. The air smelled of jasmine and old paper. As she unwrapped the book, her breath hitched. She stared at the title, her knuckles white where she gripped the cover. She didn't thank him. Instead, she placed the book on the mantelpiece and turned to face him, her expression calm, her eyes sharp as ice. "Why?" she asked. The single word was a demand. He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Let us be direct, my lord," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Why me? Why now? We have not spoken in 7 years. We are not even neighbors anymore. And you do not make a casual call. You arrive in a carriage that announces the presence of a duke's son to my entire street. You bring me a book that suggests you have given my character a great deal of thought. I am not a fool, and I am not a girl who indulges in foolish fantasies. So I will ask you again, and I expect the truth. What is the reason for this sudden and very particular interest?" It was a clinical, devastating dissection. She had laid out the evidence, anticipated his lies, and cornered him completely. He stood before her, utterly exposed. The truth of the bet rose in his throat like bile. But as he looked at her, standing so proud, her intelligence a burning fire, he couldn't do it. To tell her she was the object of a cruel joke would be an act of vandalism. It would shatter the very dignity she fought so hard to maintain. In that split second, he chose his path. He would build the perfect lie from the pieces of his own obsessive truth. "You are right to ask," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The truth is, coming back from the continent changes a man. I returned to a world that felt hollow, suffocating." He took a step toward her, closing the distance. "And then I saw you at the ball, and you were not hollow. You were real, and I remembered everything. I remembered the girl who wasn't afraid to get dirt on her dress or speak her mind. A friendship I had been a fool to let 7 years of silence destroy." The words poured out of him, a torrent of truth serving a singular, desperate lie. "My interest is not sudden, Ruth," he finished, his voice dropping to a near whisper, raw with an emotion that was terrifyingly real. "It is merely resumed. I wasn't seeking out Miss Mansfield, the fallen baron's daughter. I was looking for the one person in that entire ballroom I felt I could actually talk to. I was looking for Ruth." She stared at him, stunned into silence. He had taken every piece of her logical doubt and countered it with an emotional confession that was impossible to refute because, in its own twisted way, he meant every word. He watched her, his heart hammering. Her intelligent eyes searched his face for any hint of falsehood. But all she could see was the raw sincerity of a man drowning in his own obsession. Slowly she nodded. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, as if angered by its betrayal. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were his absolution and his damnation. He had won her trust, and in doing so had trapped them both completely. In the weeks that followed, Timothy's perfect lie took on a terrifying life of its own. It was no longer a single, desperate statement made in a sunlit parlor, but a living, breathing thing that he fed with every walk, every shared glance, every book he brought her. He ordered his carriage to her street with increasing regularity, his excuses becoming flimsier as his obsession grew more profound. He learned the cadence of her laughter, the way her brow furrowed when she was deep in thought, the quiet strength that radiated from her like warmth from a fire. He was no longer acting the part of a suitor. He was a suitor. And Ruth, intelligent, cautious Ruth, was beginning to believe him. The walls of her fortress, breached by his lie, were finally starting to crumble. The invitation to Lady Danbury's winter musical was a turning point. It was one thing to meet in the relative privacy of a park. It was another entirely to appear together in the heart of the tongue. This was a public declaration. When he arrived in his carriage to escort her, and she descended the steps in her emerald green gown, the very one from the ball, exquisitely cared for, he felt a surge of possessive pride so fierce it stole his breath. He was not winning a bet. He was showing the world the woman who had captured him completely. The air in Lady Danbury's salon was thick with the scent of beeswax and hot-spiced wine. A string trio played softly in the corner, the music a delicate counterpoint to the low hum of society gossip. For the first hour, it was perfect. He stood beside Ruth, introducing her to acquaintances, his arm protectively at her back. He saw the curious, speculative glances thrown their way, and for the first time, he welcomed them. He wanted them to see. He wanted them to see her. He was fetching her a glass of punch when a familiar voice, slick with malice, cut through the noise. "Ashbourne, a pleasure." Timothy froze, his back to the room. He knew that voice. He turned slowly. Captain Evans stood there, a glass of brandy in his hand, a predatory smile on his face. His eyes flicked from Timothy to Ruth, who was standing by the fireplace, and then back again. "I see your latest pursuit," Evans said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, "is coming along splendidly." The word pursuit landed like a punch to the gut. It was a word for a hunt, a game, a project. Timothy's hand tightened on the fragile punch glass, the crystal groaning in protest. "Evans," he said, his voice dangerously level, "this is neither the time nor the place." "Oh, I think it's the perfect place," Evans sneered, his gaze fixed on Ruth. He began to walk toward her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Timothy. He moved to intercept him, placing himself directly in Evans's path. "What do you want?" Timothy demanded, his voice a low hiss. "Merely to offer my congratulations," Evans said, his smile widening. He raised his voice, just enough to be sociable, a perfect gentleman, and to meet the lady who has accomplished what so many others have failed to do. He stepped around Timothy before he could be stopped. Ruth turned as they approached, a polite, questioning smile on her face. The sight of her innocent trust was a physical agony. "Miss Mansfield," Timothy said, his voice strained. "May I present Captain Evans, an old acquaintance from the regiment." Ruth curtsied gracefully. "Captain, it is a pleasure." Evans gave her a theatrical bow, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. "The pleasure is all mine, I assure you. You have my deepest sympathies, Miss Mansfield. Lord Ashbourne can be singularly focused when he sets his mind on winning a prize." The insult was so sharp, so venomous, that Timothy felt the blood drain from his face. He was calling her a prize to be won. Right in front of her. He saw a flicker of confusion in Ruth's eyes. She didn't understand the true meaning, but she heard the condescending tone, saw the malicious glint in the captain's eyes. Her back straightened. "I assure you, Captain, I do not require your sympathies," she said, her voice clear and cold. "Lord Ashbourne's company is its own reward." Her defense of him was 1,000 times more devastating than any accusation. She was protecting him from the consequences of his own lie. Evans let out a low chuckle, enjoying the torment he was inflicting. He looked directly at Timothy, his eyes full of triumph. "Is that so? Well, I wish you both the best of luck. Bets like these are always so unpredictable." He gave a final mocking nod and walked away, melting back into the crowd. The word hung in the air between them. Bets. Timothy stood frozen, the world tilting around him. He looked at Ruth. Her brow was furrowed, a frown of confusion on her face, as she tried to make sense of the captain's strange, hostile words. "What an unpleasant man," she murmured, turning to him. What did he mean by that? Bets like these? He looked at her trusting, questioning face, and the perfect, beautiful world he had built for her, with his lie shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The bet was no longer a guilty secret from his past. It was here, in this room, a loaded pistol aimed directly at her heart, and Captain Evans had just shown him that he was more than willing to pull the trigger. The music of the string trio swirled around them, but for Timothy, the only sound in the world was Ruth's question, sharp and clear. What did he mean by that? Bets like these? He looked at her trusting, questioning face, and a cold, primal panic seized him. His mind, trained for the split-second decisions of a battlefield, raced to find a defensible position. He manufactured a short, dismissive laugh that sounded brittle to his own ears. He took the punch glass from her hand and set it on a nearby table, a deliberate act to sever the connection to Evans's poison. "Evans," he said, his voice a careful mixture of annoyance and amusement. "You must pay him no mind. He is a man who lost a great deal of money at cards last week, and, I believe, blames me for his poor luck. He has a bitter tongue and an unfortunate fondness for brandy. His talk of bets is nothing more than the sour ramblings of a poor loser." He looked directly into her eyes, willing her to believe him. "I apologize that he accosted you. It was ungentlemanly, and I will have words with him." Her frown softened, though a flicker of confusion remained. "He seemed personally cruel." "He is," Timothy said, the truth of that statement making it all the more convincing. "And his cruelty has no place near you. The desire to get her away from this place was overwhelming. The evening has been spoiled. May I take you home?" She nodded, a quiet relief washing over her face. He escorted her from the musicale with his head held high, ignoring the curious stares that followed them. The carriage ride to her home was heavy with a new, uncertain tension. After he saw her safely inside, he stepped back into his carriage. His heart was a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He knew Evans. The night was not over for him. After a public triumph like the one he'd just engineered, Evans and Croft would not go home. They would go to their club to drink and to gloat. "Whites!" Timothy commanded his driver, his voice devoid of all emotion. An hour later, he was seated in a dark leather wingback chair in a shadowed corner of the club's smoking room. A glass of brandy sat untouched on the table beside him. He had been waiting, his protective fury cooling from a raging fire into a block of solid ice. He watched the door, every boisterous entry setting his teeth on edge. Finally they arrived. Evans and Croft came in laughing, their faces flushed with wine and victory. They were reliving the moment at the musicale, Evans performing a caricature of Timothy's stricken face for Croft's amusement. They didn't see him in the shadows. They ordered drinks and settled at a card table. Timothy rose from his chair. He walked across the room, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He didn't speak until he was standing directly over their table. They looked up, their laughter dying on their lips as they saw the cold, controlled rage in his eyes. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and dropped it onto the green felt of the table. The thud of the coins was sharp and final, silencing the nearby conversation. Croft stared at the pouch, his face paling. Evans's smug expression hardened. 50 guineas, Timothy said, his voice like ice. The wager is forfeit. I concede. It was an act of unconditional surrender, and yet it felt like the first victory he had won since the night of the ball. Evans narrowed his eyes. Running from a fight, Ashbourne. I knew you didn't have the stomach for it. This was never a fight, Timothy replied, his gaze locking with Evans's. It was a mistake, and it is over. Is it? Evans hissed, leaning forward. You think you can just pay your way out? I know your secret. One word from me, and her reputation will be in tatters. She will be a laughing stock. Timothy looked at the man he had once called a friend, and felt nothing but a cold, profound pity. The fear was gone, burned away by a protective fire so absolute it left no room for anything else. Do your worst, Timothy said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. Tell anyone you wish, but you will not use her as a pawn in this game any longer. Stay away from her, and stay away from me. He turned his back on them without another word, the concession a declaration of war. He had publicly forfeited the bet to protect her, but in doing so, he had enraged a bitter enemy who now had nothing to lose. He walked out into the cold night air, a free man in a cage of his own making, the real battle only just beginning. Timothy returned to his townhouse in the cold, pre-dawn hours, his objective now terrifyingly clear. He had to build a fortress of truth around Ruth, even if its foundation was the most profound lie of his life. His campaign began that morning. He sent a footman with a box from London's most exclusive florist. Inside, nestled on cool moss, was a single, perfect hothouse orchid, a bloom of impossible rarity and expense. The card contained only 3 words: forgive the intrusion. It was an intimate message delivered via a grand, public gesture. Later that afternoon, when he called on her, she wore the orchid pinned to the bodice of her simple wool dress. The sight of it, a symbol of his extravagant lie resting so close to her heart, made his chest ache with a terrible, beautiful pain. She greeted him not with suspicion, but with a shy, wondrous smile. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, she whispered. It is a pale imitation, he replied, the words coming from a place of sincerity so deep it startled him. He had to erase the memory of Evans's cruelty. I have arranged something, he said. A private viewing at the Royal Academy tomorrow morning, before it opens to the public. Her eyes widened. It was an offer so romantic, so perfectly attuned to who she was, that it left no room for doubt. The next morning, in the grand, silent halls of Somerset House, he watched her. She stood before a painting by Turner, her head tilted, completely lost in the canvas, her mother chatting quietly with a gallery attendant nearby. In the soft morning light, with the masterpieces of their age as their only witnesses, the grubby reality of the bet felt a world away. Here, in this space he had created for her, his feelings were the only truth that mattered. As she turned from the painting, her face was alive with an unguarded joy he had never seen before. She looked at him, and the last of her defenses seemed to melt away. "How did you know," she asked, her voice soft, "that this is what I would love?" "I told you," he said, his voice a low thrum in the quiet hall. "I was looking for Ruth, and I am beginning to find her." She took a small, unconscious step toward him, the space between them shrinking until he could feel the warmth radiating from her. "Timothy," she began, her voice full of a new, fragile warmth. "After the other night, I confess I was unsettled. But this, I feel," she searched for the word, "I feel safe with you." The word shattered his control. Safe. He was her protector, and he was her greatest threat. Her trust, so freely given, was a fire in his veins. The soldier, the duke's son, the liar, all of him receded, and all that was left was a man overwhelmed. He didn't think. He acted. He cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. Her eyes widened in surprise, her lips parting on a silent, questioning breath. He leaned in and pressed his mouth to hers. It was not a deep kiss. It was hesitant, tender, and yet firm with the weight of all the things he could not say. It was a desperate, physical confession. For a single, breathless moment, the world stopped. There was no bet, no Evans, no lie, only the soft, warm press of her lips against his, a silent answer to a question he hadn't dared to ask. When he pulled back, he kept his hand on her cheek, his gaze locked on hers. She looked stunned, her eyes wide and luminous, her cheeks flushed a deep rose. She wasn't angry. She was breathless. He had meant to build a fortress around her, but with that single, reckless kiss, he had instead sealed his own fate. He had just given her the most honest expression of his feelings, and it was tangled inextricably with the most devastating lie of his life. The kiss had connected them, truly and deeply. And he knew, with a soul-deep certainty, that when the truth finally came out, it would not just break her trust, it would tear her heart in two. The 2 weeks that followed the kiss at the Royal Academy were a dream. The fragile, hesitant connection between them bloomed into a deep and certain intimacy. Timothy's courtship was relentless, a perfect campaign of tenderness and devotion. They walked for hours, read to each other by the fire, and in the quiet moments, a new and breathtaking reality began to form between them. She was falling in love, completely and irrevocably. The Duchess of Richmond's annual winter ball was to be their triumph. When Timothy arrived to collect her, she descended the stairs not in the familiar green gown, but in a new one of deep sapphire silk, a gift from him with a note that read, "So the world can see you as I do." The ballroom was a galaxy of shimmering jewels. For the first hour, they were inseparable, his hand always on hers, his gaze never straying. The whispers that followed them were of envy. The entire ton could see that the Duke's son was utterly captivated. It was an elderly but immensely powerful cabinet minister, Lord Wellesley, who finally broke the spell. He approached them with a polite but firm smile, his eyes fixed on Timothy. After a brief, correct nod to Ruth, he addressed Timothy directly. "Ashbourne, a moment, if you please. Your father mentioned you had some thoughts on the Irish stud. I'd be keen to hear them before I depart." It was a summons cloaked in a request. He turned to Ruth, his eyes full of a deep, frustrated apology. "I will be but a moment," he murmured, squeezing her hand before reluctantly following the minister. Ruth watched him go, feeling secure and content. She found a quiet alcove near the refreshment table, a perfect vantage point to watch the dancers. She was so lost in her own thoughts that she didn't at first notice the group of women who had gathered nearby, their laughter high and sharp. "My dear, have you seen Lord Ashbourne tonight?" one of them said. "He looks utterly besotted." "It's the talk of the season," another voice replied. "But do you hear how it began?" Ruth's attention was caught. She listened, an idle, harmless curiosity. A third voice, prettier and higher than the rest, chimed in. It was a voice that delighted in being the center of attention. "My dears, you simply will not believe what I overheard the other day. I was in the morning room, and my husband was in his study with Lieutenant Croft, and they thought I couldn't hear. They were laughing about it." Ruth's blood went cold. The woman, Mrs. Evans, continued, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It was all a wager. A 50-guinea bet between the officers. They said Ashbourne was too selective, so they chose a challenge for him. The most unlikely, plainest little mouse they could find." The world began to tilt. The music of the orchestra faded into a distant, buzzing drone. They pointed across the ballroom at the poor Miss Mansfield. Mrs. Evans trilled, savouring every cruel word. "And my husband wagered 50 guineas that Ashbourne couldn't make her fall in love with him within 6 months. Can you imagine? So you see, my dears, don't be fooled by all this devotion you see tonight. It's not love. He's doing it to win the bet. I wonder if she has any idea she's little more than a 50-guinea prize." The words did not land like a blow. They were quieter, more insidious. They were like a poison, seeping into her ears and turning everything beautiful into something rotten. The private gallery viewing, the orchid, the books, the walks, his voice reading to her by the fire, his lips so tender on hers in the silent gallery. It was all a lie, a performance, an act in a cruel, humiliating game. He wasn't in love with her. He was winning. A strange, terrifying calm washed over her. Her heart, which had been so full of warmth only moments before, felt as though it had turned to a shard of ice in her chest. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She turned, her movements stiff, mechanical. She walked away from the alcove, past the glittering dancers, her sapphire gown a blur of colour. She did not look for Timothy. She did not want to see the lie in his eyes. She found a footman in the hall. "My cloak, please." He brought it, and she draped it over her shoulders, her hands fumbling with the clasp. She ignored the footman who offered to call her carriage. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out alone into the biting, unforgiving cold of the winter night. The cold was a comfort. It was the only thing that felt real. The sudden cold was a brutal slap of reality against her skin, stealing the air from her lungs. She stood on the top step, gulping in the sharp, freezing night, each breath a painful, jagged thing. The suffocating warmth of the ballroom, the scent of wax and wine and perfume, had been a lie. This cold, this was the truth. It's not love. He's doing it to win the bet. The words echoed in the sudden, vast silence of her mind, twisting every beautiful memory into something ugly and deformed. The orchid wasn't a gift. It was a tactic. The private viewing wasn't a romance. It was a stage. And the kiss, a wave of nausea and shame so profound it made her physically sway, washed over her. Her hand flew to her mouth. It hadn't been a confession. It had been the ultimate act of deception. The checkmate. The moment he knew with certainty that he had won. She hadn't been kissed. She had been conquered. A 50-guinea prize. She had to move. She couldn't bear the thought of him walking out those doors to find her, his face a perfect mask of concern. Her feet began to move, carrying her down the steps and onto the street. She pulled her thin cloak tighter around the sapphire silk of her gown, the luxurious fabric now feeling like a costume. She didn't know where she was going. She was just moving away from the pain. But after she had walked some little way on the dirty, uneven cobblestones, the cold reality of her situation seeped through the haze of her agony. She was a lady, alone, at night, in a ball gown. She was lost, freezing, and drawing unwanted stares from the shadows. This was impossible. It was a fool's errand. A wave of bitter practicality washed over her. Defeated, humiliated, she turned back, the walk to the Duchess's townhouse a fresh torment. She would not go back inside. As she approached, she saw a liveried footman standing guard by the doors. His footman, she recognized, from his family's crest on the uniform. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She approached him, her face a cold, emotionless mask that she hoped hid the shattering of her heart. "I wish to go home," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all inflection. "Lord Ashbourne's carriage will take me." The footman, seeing her distress but bound by duty, bowed immediately. "Of course, Miss Mansfield." He led her to the waiting carriage, the same one she had felt such pride stepping into just a few hours ago. She sank into the cold leather seat without a word, a prisoner being transported from the scene of her own execution. As the carriage lurched forward, she stared blankly out the window, the glittering lights of London blurring into a meaningless smear through her silent, streaming tears. Inside the ballroom, Timothy's polite smile was a mask of iron, held in place by sheer will. Lord Wellesley droned on about bloodlines and stud fees, but the words were a meaningless drone in his ears. His entire being was attuned to the other side of the room, to a flash of sapphire silk he could no longer see. He nodded, murmured, "Indeed, my lord," but his eyes were in constant motion, scanning the crowd over the minister's shoulder. Where had she gone? Had she found a seat? Was she speaking with Lady Danbury? The thoughts were a frantic, silent litany beneath the surface of the conversation. The 15 minutes he'd been gone felt like an eternity. He finally saw an opening, stepping back with a respectful bow. "A brilliant strategy, my lord. Forgive me, I must return to Miss Mansfield." He moved through the glittering crowd, his heart a tight knot of unease. He made his way to the alcove where he'd left her. It was empty. He scanned the nearby refreshment table, the settees lining the walls. Nothing. The unease began to curdle into a quiet, cold dread. He made a full circuit of the grand ballroom, his polite nods to acquaintances becoming more strained, his search more urgent. His frantic gaze swept past a group near the orchestra, and for a brief, jarring moment, he'd locked eyes with Captain Evans. Evans was standing with his wife, a triumphant, cat-like smile on her face as she chatted with her friends. The captain saw Timothy looking and gave him a short, insolent nod, a gesture not of respect, but of smug victory. A cold spike of revulsion went through Timothy. He returned the nod with a look of pure ice and immediately continued his search, dismissing them. His only concern was Ruth, but she was nowhere. The dread was now a suffocating weight. He stepped out into the grand, cold hall. He pushed through the heavy main doors and stepped outside. The cold bit at him. The space where his crested carriage should have been waiting was empty. He stood there, stunned. He went back inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. He made another, slower circuit of the rooms, his gaze now frantic. The faces of the guests blurred into a meaningless collage. She was gone. He went back outside. It had been nearly an hour since he'd left her side. Just then, his carriage came rattling up the street, the horse's breath pluming in the frigid air. The footman leaped down, his face pale with worry. "My lord, my apologies." "Where were you?" Timothy demanded, his voice sharp with a fear he couldn't contain. "Where is Miss Mansfield?" The footman looked bewildered. "I took her home, my lord," as she requested. The words hung in the air, nonsensical. Home? She requested to be taken home. Was she unwell? She did not say, my lord," the footman stammered. "She simply came out and said she wished to leave. I thought it was at your instruction." Timothy stared at the empty carriage, his mind reeling. She had left, without a word. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. His first instinct, a primal, overwhelming urge, was to get in the carriage and go to her. No. But he stopped himself, a wave of cold reality crashing over his panic. He saw the image in his mind, his carriage arriving at her modest home in the dead of night. It would be a scandal. It would ruin what was left of her reputation. His need to protect her was the only thing stronger than his need to see her. He was trapped, tormented by 1,000 unanswered questions, his heart screaming at him to go to her. But the rigid rules of their world held him in an iron grip. He got into the carriage, the seat beside him cold and achingly empty. "Home," he said to the driver, his voice a hoarse whisper. He would have to endure the agony of the night, the torment of not knowing. But at the first possible, acceptable hour of the morning, he would be at her door, and he would have his answer. The first, pale grey light of dawn had not yet broken the darkness when Ruth rose. Sleep had been a foreign country she could not enter. She moved about her small room with a quiet, numb efficiency, a ghost in her own life. The sapphire gown lay crumpled on a chair, a silken wound in the dim light. She wouldn't look at it. She pulled on a practical, dark wool travelling dress, the rough fabric a welcome, grounding pain against her skin. She packed a single valise, a few dresses, a book, her writing materials, a life reduced to what could be carried. Every object was a memory, a testament to the foolish girl who had lived here only yesterday, the girl who had believed in a kiss. She pushed the thought away, building a wall of ice around her heart, brick by painful brick. A soft knock came at her door. Her mother entered, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face etched with a deep maternal concern. "Ruth, what is this?" "The maid said you'd ordered a post-chaise." Ruth turned from her packing, her face a carefully constructed mask of calm. "I am going to Bath, Mother. To stay with Cousin Eleanor for a while." Her mother's eyes searched her face, seeing past the lie to the devastation beneath. "My dear girl, what has happened? Last night you were so happy." To hear her own recent happiness spoken aloud was an agony that nearly shattered Ruth's composure. She took a breath, the air burning her lungs. She could not tell her the truth. She could not speak the humiliating words aloud. To do so would be to break her mother's heart and her own pride. "I am unwell," she lied, the words tasting like ash. "The city, it is too much for me. I need the air, the quiet." Her mother knew it was an excuse, but she saw the fierce, shattered look in her daughter's eyes and didn't press. She simply crossed the room and pulled Ruth into her arms. Ruth stood stiffly for a moment, then collapsed into the embrace, a single, silent sob shaking her frame before she wrestled it back down. "You will write?" her mother whispered, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "The moment I arrive," Ruth promised, pulling away. She was an open wound, and she could not bear to be touched. As the city clocks began to strike the hour, the rattle of a carriage on the cobblestones below signaled the end. She gave her mother one last, desperate hug and was gone. She stepped into the hired post-chaise without a backward glance, the door shutting with a sound of absolute finality. As the carriage pulled away from the quiet street, leaving her life behind, Ruth did not cry. The ice in her heart had frozen her tears. 2 hours later, at precisely the earliest moment a gentleman could make a morning call, Timothy's grand carriage stopped before the Mansfield townhome. He had not slept. He had spent the night pacing, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and a cold, creeping dread. He stepped onto the pavement, his immaculate coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the raw anxiety etched on his face. The door was opened by the maid, whose eyes widened in surprise. "My lord, I wish to see Miss Mansfield," he said, his voice tight. A moment later, he was shown into the small parlour. It was empty. The scent of jasmine was still in the air, a ghost of her presence. He stood there, his hat in his hands, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was not Ruth who entered, but her mother. The Baroness Mansfield looked at him, her expression one of polite, unbreachable sorrow. There was no welcome in her eyes. "My lord," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Baroness," he began, dispensing with the pleasantries, "forgive the intrusion at this hour, but I must speak with your daughter. I was so worried when she left last night. Is she well?" Mrs. Mansfield's gaze did not waver. "Miss Mansfield is not here, my lord." The words didn't register at first. "Not here? Is she out walking?" "No," her mother said, and her voice was the sound of a closing door. "She left for Bath at sunrise." Bath. The word landed with a dead, final weight in the silent room, extinguishing all hope. A place one went to heal, to escape, 100 miles and a world away. It made no sense. "Bath?" he echoed, his voice hollow. "But why? Did she say why?" "My daughter was feeling unwell," Mrs. Mansfield replied, reciting the flimsy excuse Ruth had left for her. She felt the country air was necessary for her recovery. He stared at her, the polite lie a confirmation of his worst fears. Unwell. It was him. Something he had done. The image of Evans's sneering face flashed in his mind. He was standing in her home, surrounded by the scent of her, and she was gone. She had run from him. He opened his mouth to protest, to demand a better explanation, but the look on her mother's face stopped him. It was the look of a woman protecting her child. He was the enemy here. He gave a stiff, jerky nod, the room seeming to tilt around him. "I see. Thank you, Baroness." He turned and walked out, a man in a trance. He stepped back into his carriage, the door shutting him into the cold, empty space. He had come for an answer, and he had found only an absence. A gaping, wound-like absence where Ruth had been. And in that moment, the full weight of his despair crashed down upon him. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew, with a soul-deep certainty, that he had just lost her. The townhouse was a prison. Every gilded mirror, every silent, ticking clock seemed to mock Timothy with the time he was losing. He paced the length of his library, a caged animal, the image of Ruth's devastated face, a torment he could not escape. He had to know the truth. Not just what had happened, but how. By late afternoon, his grief had cooled into a hard, singular purpose. He went to his club. He found Lieutenant Croft alone in the library, staring into a newspaper he wasn't reading. Croft looked up as he approached, his face already pale with a quiet guilt. Timothy stood over him, his presence a heavy, oppressive weight. "She's gone," he said, his voice low and dead. "She left for Bath at sunrise." The news hit Croft with visible force. The newspaper in his hands trembled slightly as his face went from guilty to horrified. "Bath?" he whispered. He knew. "Tell me what happened," Timothy commanded. "Tell me how." Croft swallowed hard, finally meeting his gaze. His expression was miserable. "After you left the ball last night, Evans came here. He was in a rage. Truly, I've never seen him so furious. He said Lord Hemphill had accosted him. Timothy waited, his entire body rigid. Apparently, word got around that Miss Mansfield had fled the ball in distress. Croft continued, his voice barely a whisper. Hemphill told Evans that his wife had been gossiping loudly about the wager right before it happened. Evans was furious with her, called her a fool for being so indiscreet. He was terrified of what the Duke might do. Croft looked down at his hands, ashamed. He kept saying, "We were always so discreet. I am not sure how she got the info, unless she eavesdropped on our conversation." He was trying to make sense of it himself, but the timing, it was clear. Miss Mansfield must have been nearby. She must have heard every word, Timothy. The truth, clinical and brutal, landed with devastating clarity. He understood everything now in a sickening, blinding flash. Ruth's sudden departure, the coldness in her mother's eyes, the devastating reason for her flight. She didn't think he had been unkind. She thought every single moment they had shared, the books, the gallery, the kiss, was a calculated move in a cruel and humiliating game. She thought his love was a lie, a wave of self-loathing so profound it nearly brought him to his knees, washed over him. He turned and walked out of the club, leaving Croft sitting in a pool of his own shame. His despair immediately galvanized into frantic, desperate action. Propriety be damned. He would ride for Bath. He would find her. He would get down on his knees, and he would tell her everything about his foolish pride, about his concession, about the way the lie had become the most profound truth of his life. He burst into his townhouse, shouting for his valet. "Pack my riding clothes. I am leaving for Bath at once." He was in his study, pulling on his riding boots, a map of the road to Bath spread across his desk, when his butler entered, a silver tray in his hand. "My lord," the butler said, his voice grave. "An urgent dispatch from the Horse Guards." Timothy tore the sealed missive open. It was a summons. Direct orders. An unexpected complication on the French coast required the immediate, temporary recommissioning of several experienced officers for a period of no less than 3 months. His name was at the top of the list. He was to report to his garrison in Dover by week's end. He stared at the paper, the ink blurring before his eyes. 3 months. An eternity for her heart to harden against him, for the lie to become an unshakable truth. He had been on the verge of riding to her, of fighting for her, of fixing the catastrophic damage, and in a single moment, with a single piece of paper, the world had conspired to stop him. He was trapped, bound by duty and the king's command. He could not go to her. All he could do was endure. And in that moment, the true agony of his punishment began.
Burning in my eyes. If you could see my hidden face, the one I guard, the one I embrace, you'd hear the thunder in my chest. You'd know this love won't let me rest. If you could see, you know it's true. Every silence aches for you.
I bite my tongue to choke the name. Your touch could drive me half insane. I turn away, but
the dispatch was not a piece of paper. It was a prison sentence. His orders were for 3 months, but he knew in his soul it would be an eternity. He was trapped. Duty, the iron core of his entire existence, had become his tormentor. He could not ride to Bath. But he could write. Before leaving for Dover, he sent a desperate note to Baroness Mansfield, begging for an address where he might send a letter to Ruth. A reply came with a single, unadorned address, Westmere Vale, Bath. It was a sliver of hope. He wrote to Ruth that night, a torrent of controlled desperation, telling her he had been called away but would explain everything upon his return. He told her he loved her. He sent the letter on its long journey, a fragile paper vessel carrying the entirety of his soul. Then his punishment began. The 3 months of his initial sentence bled into 4, then 5, as the standoff with Napoleon's invasion force across the Channel dragged on. Summer faded into a bleak, wind-swept autumn. The silence from Bath was absolute, a constant, screaming void. The hope he had clung to began to wither and die with the last leaves on the trees. The days were a blur of drills and inspections, but the nights were his hell. He walked the frozen battlements alone, the wind whipping off the Channel, a constant, mournful cry. He saw her face in the churning grey water, in the low-hanging clouds. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. Finally, as the first snows of a hard winter began to fall, his orders came. The immediate threat had passed for now. His duty was fulfilled. He was released. He did not go to London. He did not stop to rest. He rode to the nearest livery, secured the fastest horse he could find, and turned its head west. He was a man hollowed out by despair, fueled by a single, desperate mission. Through the snow and the biting wind, he rode. He would find her at Westmere Vale. He would stand before her, with no pride, no excuses, only the raw, broken truth. And he would not leave until she heard him, even if her answer was the one he had been dreading for all these agonizing months. The man who rode into Bath was not the Duke's son. He was a soldier returning from a war far crueler than any fought on a battlefield. It was winter again. A fresh, silent snow was falling, blanketing the countryside in a shroud of white. He had ridden with a single-minded, almost feral intensity. The address her mother had given him, a sacred text clutched in his memory. Westmere Vale. He reached the quiet estate as the sun was setting, casting long, blue shadows across the snow-covered lawns. The house was elegant, secluded, a peaceful world he was about to shatter. A maid answered the door, her eyes widening at the sight of his mud-splattered, travel-worn uniform. He did not have to ask for Ruth. Her cousins, 2 kind, gentle-faced women, met him in the hall. They saw the raw desperation on his face, the exhaustion that went bone deep. "She is not here, my lord," the elder cousin said, her voice soft with a pity that twisted in his gut. "She walks by the lake at this hour. It is her habit," she pointed through a window. "You will find her there." He followed the path, his heavy riding boots crunching in the fresh snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. And then he saw her, a lone figure in a dark, fur-trimmed pelisse, standing at the edge of a half-frozen lake. Her back was to him. The snow fell around her, melting into her honey-blonde hair, which was pinned up simply. She was so still. She seemed a part of the landscape, a statue of sorrow. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the long, sleepless nights in Dover. He had prepared speeches, pleas, declarations. But now, seeing her, all the words vanished, leaving only a raw, overwhelming ache in his chest. He had stopped on his journey at a small, sheltered cottage where a cluster of snowdrops were blooming defiantly through the frost. He had paid the woman an absurd price for a small, hand-tied bouquet. They were in his gloved hand now, their delicate white heads trembling in the cold. Flowers of hope. Flowers that bloomed in the dead of winter. He took a step forward. The crunch of his boot on the snow was the only sound in the world. She turned. Her face was pale, thinner than he remembered. The vibrant spark in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, soul-deep weariness that hollowed him out. She saw him, and her expression did not change. There was no shock, no anger, no joy. There was nothing. It was the face of a woman who had armored her heart so completely that nothing could get in. He stood before her, the snow falling softly between them, dusting the scarlet of his uniform. He held out the small bouquet of snowdrops. The silence was a vast, frozen expanse, heavy with the weight of his betrayal and her pain. Everything unsaid screamed between them. He stood before her, the snow falling softly between them, dusting the scarlet of his uniform. He held out the small bouquet of snowdrops. The silence was a vast, frozen expanse, heavy with the weight of his betrayal and her pain. "Ruth," he said. His voice was a raw, broken thing, hoarse from the long ride and the months of shouting her name into the uncaring wind. She looked at the flowers, then at his face, and her expression, which had been a mask of weary emptiness, hardened into something cold and sharp. "I have no need of flowers, my lord," she said, her voice brittle. Using his title was a deliberate cruelty. A wall of ice slammed down between them. The rejection was so absolute, so final, that it nearly broke him. But he had not come this far to be turned away by a wall. He had come to tear it down, stone by painful stone. He let the snowdrops fall from his numb fingers, the small white bouquet sinking into the fresh snow at their feet. The gesture was a surrender. The flowers were a pretense. Only the truth mattered now. "It began as a bet," he said, the words tearing from his throat, ugly and raw in the clean, cold air. A disgusting, prideful wager made by fools in a ballroom. 50 guineas. He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tremor. It was the first sign of life he had seen in her, and it gave him the desperate courage to continue. "They chose you, and I, in my arrogance and my foolish pride, accepted. That is the truth, and it is the most dishonorable act of my life." He took a half-step closer, his gaze locked on hers, begging her to see past the monster he was describing. But it was a lie I couldn't live. From the moment we danced, from the first real conversation we had in the park, none of it was for the bet. It was for me. I was selfish. I wanted to hear you laugh. I wanted to see the fire in your eyes. The bet was a ghost, a shadow I was running from. But you were real. He saw the flicker of a memory in her eyes, a shadow of the woman who had stood with him in the art gallery. "That night at the Music Hall," he pressed on, his voice cracking. "After Evans spoke to you, I lied. I lied to protect you in the moment. But later that night, I went to the club. I threw the 50 guineas on the table, and I conceded the wager. I forfeited. I did it because I couldn't bear for one more second of my time with you to be tainted by it. I had to be free of it, so that I could court you honestly, so that I could be worthy of the trust you were giving me. This was it, the part she didn't know. Her eyes, which had been so hard and cold, widened. A flicker of confusion, of disbelief, warred with the deep, settled pain. "I was going to tell you," he whispered, the words a raw plea. "I swear to you, I was going to find a way to tell you everything. But then you were gone, and they sent me away." He finally closed the distance between them, standing so close he could see the snowflakes melting on her lashes. "The bet was a lie, Ruth. A monstrous lie that began in pride and ended in shame. But what I found with you, that was real. The man who stood with you in the gallery, the man who kissed you, that was real. I love you. I loved you then, and I have spent every day of this hellish exile loving you, and that is the only truth that matters." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. The wall of ice she had built around her heart was cracking, splintering under the force of his words. A single hot tear escaped her eye, and traced a path down her pale, frozen cheek. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, as if to stifle a sob, or to hold in the pieces of her breaking heart. Her trembling hand pressed against her lips, but it could not contain the sound that escaped, a single, ragged sob, torn from the depths of her soul, the sound of a heart breaking, or perhaps of one beginning to heal. "How could you?" she whispered, the words fractured by her tears. "How could you be so cruel?" He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer excuses. He stood and took the full force of her pain, knowing he deserved every bit of it. "Do you have any idea what that felt like?" she continued, her voice rising with the agony of the last few months. "To know that every kind word, every thoughtful gesture, every glance was a lie? To be a prize? A joke for you and your friends?" "It wasn't," he said, his voice thick with a desperate sincerity. "It began that way. God forgive me. But it did not end that way. It ended that night at the musicale." She shook her head, the tears now streaming freely down her face, washing away the months of ice. "You lied to me. When I asked you, you looked me in the eye and you lied." "I lied to protect you," he said, his own voice breaking. Evans had made his threat. "I was a coward. I thought a lie was kinder than the truth. I was wrong." Her gaze, blurred with tears, fixed on his. She latched onto the one part of his story that made no sense, the one piece that did not fit the narrative of her own humiliation. You conceded the bet?" she whispered, the question full of a desperate, fragile hope. "You paid them the money?" "Yes." "Why?" It was the most important question she had ever asked. "Because I had to," he said, his voice raw with the simple, agonizing truth. "I could not let them have that power over you, over us. I could not bear for one more second of my time with you to be part of their disgusting game. It was the only way to make it clean, the only way to make what I felt for you real. That was it. That was the truth she had needed to hear. The wall of ice she had so carefully constructed around her heart didn't just crack, it shattered, dissolving into a torrent of unstoppable grief. The pain of the betrayal, the agony of the lonely months, the breathtaking shock of this new, impossible hope. It was too much to bear. A deep, wrenching sob tore through her, and her legs gave way. He was there in an instant, his arms wrapping around her, catching her as she fell. She collapsed against his chest, her hands clutching the rough wool of his uniform as she wept. She cried for the girl who had been so cruelly deceived, for the lonely woman who had grieved in silence, and for the overwhelming, terrifying possibility that it hadn't all been a lie. He held her, his own tears falling silently into her hair. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of her, the reality of her, after so many months of her being nothing but a ghost. I thought I had lost you," she sobbed against his chest, her words muffled. He held her tighter, his voice a broken whisper in her ear. "You never did. I was the one who was lost." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her tear-stained face. "But I'm here now, and I will not leave you again." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a gentle, reverent press of his lips against her skin. It was not a kiss of passion, but a promise, a new beginning, here, in the silent, falling snow, at the edge of a frozen lake. And as she finally, tremulously, leaned into his embrace, the world, which had been so cold for so long, began to feel warm again. The journey back to London was a quiet, fragile miracle. He brought Ruth to her mother's door, and in the tearful, grateful smile the Baroness gave him, he received his blessing. He left Ruth there, in the warm safety of her mother's embrace, with a promise to return the next day. He returned to his own townhouse, exhausted, but for the first time in months, at peace. He was pouring a brandy when his butler announced unexpected visitors. He turned, his posture immediately stiffening. It was Evans and Croft. They entered the room, looking pale and strained, shadows of the confident men they once were. Timothy's expression was ice. "If you have come for my forgiveness," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you have wasted your journey." Croft flinched as if struck. Evans, the proud, arrogant captain, did something that stunned Timothy to his core. He dropped to one knee. Croft, seeing his friend's desperate act, immediately followed, the two of them kneeling before him on the Turkish rug. "We have not come for your forgiveness, Timothy," Evans said, his voice raw with a humility Timothy had never heard before. "We have come to beg for it." Timothy stared at them, speechless. "We were fools," Croft burst out, his voice thick with agony. "Arrogant, meddling fools. We never meant for it to cause such pain. We swear it, the sight of them, his oldest friends, kneeling in his library, was too much. The months of anger, of solitary torment, of despair, it all crashed down on him at once. He turned his back on them, unable to look, his hand coming up to cover his mouth as a strange, convulsive sound escaped him. It was a laugh, a single, incredulous, broken laugh. The sound grew, a wild, unrestrained release of all the tension he had carried for so long, and then, just as quickly, the laughter turned into something else. The laugh broke, and a sob tore from his chest. The laughter became tears, tears of sheer, bone-deep relief that the nightmare was finally, truly over. He wiped his eyes, taking a ragged breath to compose himself. When he turned back around, they were still there, kneeling, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He looked down at them, and the last of his anger melted away, replaced by a deep, abiding affection. "Get up, you fools," he said, his voice thick but clear. They scrambled to their feet. A fragile silence hung in the air before Timothy let out another, softer laugh. And this time they joined him, the sound of their shared laughter, a balm on the wounds between them. "We thought this was the end," Croft said quietly when the laughter subsided. "The end of a beautiful friendship." "It nearly was," Timothy admitted. He looked at Evans. "Why?" "Because we were afraid of losing you," Evans said, all pretense gone. And then he explained everything. The clumsy, misguided test, the fear of seeing him a ghost in a uniform. He recounted the moments, his voice full of a new, sincere admiration. "Did you see your own face at the music hall? You were a lion. But the masterpiece was here, at the club, when you threw down that money. You weren't conceding a bet. You were choosing her over your own pride. That's when we knew. We knew you had a heart for softness, after all." The next day, with his friendships restored, Timothy did the one thing he knew he must. He escorted Ruth to his father's townhouse. They were shown into the Duke's imposing study. The Duke looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. Timothy stood tall, his hand resting protectively on the small of Ruth's back. "Father, I have brought Miss Mansfield to see you. We are to be married." The Duke's gaze moved to Ruth, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Baron Mansfield's girl," he murmured. He looked from his determined son to the quiet, dignified woman at his side. When did this all blossom? How strange. Little Ruth. He was silent for a long moment, and then he gave a single, decisive nod. They had wanted a simple wedding, but the Duke would not hear of it. A hole and corner affair? Unthinkable, he had declared. The heir to this dukedom will be married at St. George's, Hanover Square, as is proper. And so, the spring that followed brought the grandest wedding of the season. Ruth, radiant in ivory silk, walked down the aisle of the magnificent church, which was filled with a sea of London's high society. In the front pew, beside the Baroness, sat Captain Evans and Lieutenant Croft, their faces a portrait of genuine, profound relief. At the grand wedding breakfast, they presented their gift, a heavy, silver loving cup. The inscription read, "To Timothy and Ruth, for the best 50 guineas we ever lost." That evening, as the sun was setting, Timothy found Ruth in the garden of their new country home. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "So it was never a bet," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "It was," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we were not the prize. It was my heart, and I lost, completely and utterly." She laughed then, a sound full of pure, unadulterated joy. "So you see," he murmured, his hand gently coming to rest on her still flat stomach, where their child, a secret they had only just begun to share, was growing. "It seems that in the end, we all won." She looked up at him, her love a tangible, living thing in the soft, evening light. And as he lowered his head to kiss her, he knew that their story, which had begun with a lie in the dead of winter, had finally found its truth in the warmth of a new spring.
I hide my love behind closed eyes. A storm that rages never dies. You think I'm calm, but underneath, my heart is breaking short of breath.
I keep my hands folded tight to stop them reaching for you tonight. My jaw is set but can't disguise the fire burning in my eyes. If you could see my hidden face, the one I guard, the one I embrace, you'd hear the thunder in my chest. You'd know this love won't let me rest. If you could see,
You know it's true.
every silence aches for you.
I bite my tongue, I choke the name. Your touch could drive me half insane. I turn away, but still I burn. A love too fierce, too hard to learn.
I watch you cry, it splits me through, and still I hide what I can't prove. If you could stand inside my skin, you'd feel the war I'm holding in. If you could see my hidden face, the one I guard, the one I embrace, you'd hear the thunder in my chest. You'd know this love won't let me rest. If you could see,
You know it's true.
every silence aches for you.
My fists are closed, but not with hate.
My lips are sealed but beg the fate.
My eyes betray what I conceal. Love this raw can never heal. If you could see my breaking smile, you know I've loved you all the while. The world can't take what I confess. It lives in silence, nothing less.
And if you saw me in the dark, you'd find your shadow in my heart. The pain, the fear, the jealous fire, they're only proof of my desire. If you could see my hidden face, the one I guard, the one I brace, you'd hear the thunder in my chest. You'd know this love won't let me rest. If you could see, you know it's true. Every silence aches for you. Yes, if you could see, you know it's true. Every silence aches for you.